All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for the Campus Safety Active Shooter Preparedness webinar today. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping items. We'll be hosting a live Q&A with all of our speakers at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to submit those questions to us through the webinar platform. And to kick off today's presentation, I'd like to make a few introductions. My name is Elizabeth Benefro. I'm the Director of Marketing here at OmniAlert, and I'll moderate the webinar today. I'm joined by our guest speakers, Bruce Canal, Education Segment Development Manager at Access Communications, Ara Bagdasarian, co-founder of OmniAlert and Zero Now, Brandon Rohn, Assistant Director of Training at Navigate 360, and Jeff Morgan, Director of Corporate Security and Resiliency at LendingTree. Team, thanks so much for being with us today. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Bruce.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Welcome everyone to this webinar. We hope that you really find this interesting. We put some effort toward this because it is a very critical and very important piece to good school security. You know, we talk about school security, and we want to kind of impart with you the holistic approach to good security, and you're going to hear different people speak about that in their various ways. It involves everything and everyone, and that's the critical piece to holistic. There's not one solution. We don't believe there's one solution that really could solve the issue of active shooter or any other anomaly for that matter in a school security environment. So we've been trying to think more about being proactive, about prevention, driven more than just a reactive thing. You know, you've got things that we're working harder on with policies, you know, for the parents and for of course the students, staff, administrators, handbooks, emergency management response, all these things kind of coming together. And then you add the piece of security management. And the security management piece is the school resource officers. You know, it is the administrators. It's a single point of entry. It's the fortress kind of thinking, not a prison, but a fortress. We want to keep the bad elements and the bad situations out and let our kids enjoy the school environment. And then technology, and I'm going to touch a little deeper about the technology and how that plays a role. But I'm very adamant that the technology alone is not the total solution, and it really does take a holistic approach. So what's new today, especially in video surveillance technology? Well, probably more than anything, we're looking at analytics. You know, I've always tried to explain to end users that, you know, you've got, I kind of use the acronym IRI. That's the information, that's the recognition, and that's the identification. That's kind of a level of video technology that we have in the industry together today. But analytics is what really brings the information piece and enhances it. More than just seeing people out on the in a parking lot, it's being able to identify, you know, how long they've been there, what time of the day, should they not even be there, those kind of things, and then to report those things either up through the system to make an alert to someone, something of this nature. But we have loitering detection, of course, could work very well at 2 o'clock in the morning if somebody's hanging around a school door where they've already trespassed, maybe gone over the fence, and now they're standing at a door. Are they thinking about breaking the glass and going in and to steal a you know, some type of video equipment or a laptop or something or anything else? Well, possibly, and again, the analytic can see it. Gun detection, we're going to talk a little about that. Sound detection, that all kind of plays a role. Even smoking and vaping detection. Many people don't realize that actually prior to 2020, when we faced the pandemic of COVID, it was determined that vaping is probably the next pandemic, or the next epidemic rather, in school environments, because there's so many middle school and high school students are electing to vape at a time when their young lungs are not prepared for this kind of a situation. And maybe that's the only silver lining we saw to the whole school environment of vaping, because there was very few schools that were even open in 2020. Radar, an excellent thing to determine those, especially in those areas where maybe you don't really care to know who it is, but you certainly don't want them on your football field at 2 o'clock in the morning, or your baseball diamond, or whatever the situation is. So, and some of the other features that you talk about cameras that go beyond the IRI. It's things like Light Finder and Zipstream. You'll find out, for example, a lot of your folks in the information department would love to find out that you can be able to compress video at 50% or more. And here's the thing, while it's very important to you as a security person or maybe a school administrator on this video, it's very important to you. Your IT people are concerned because they've got bandwidth issues. They've got one-to-one devices now they're dealing with, and they're trying to find ways to be able to keep down the bandwidth and save money there while still providing you with adequate security surveillance. And Light Finder, basically, it turns a 2 a.m. image into a 2 p.m. image in full color. So let's talk about audio for a second. This is what's really new. Probably a lot of school administrators are not aware of this. There's IP audio nowadays that actually are giving you the ability to have pre-recorded announcements. If you have a situation where you've got folks that are trying to break into a school building at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that analytic can make an announcement through a pre-recorded audio speaker that there's the police are coming, stand there and wait for it, or an impromptu announcement. If you are an assistant principal or principal, you've got a thunderstorm moving in, you want to make sure everybody knows that you need to get into the building right away, those kind of things. That's really critical to the way it works. So that's just kind of the few things on the audio world that we're kind of excited about. Access control, yes, no doubt about it. Smart cards and the new things, they open doors. They pay for the lunch. They'll buy pencils at the bookstore. They'll pay for the football tickets in college football team on a higher ed campus. It's used, of course, as an identification. And of course, the nice thing about it is if it's lost or gets stolen, you just turn it off and there's no need to go out and record keys and locks. If I could see a show of hands, I'd say how many of you ever experienced that before, and you're probably reluctant to raise your hand because you know how much it costs to record doors, and access control cards can really control that. I alluded to this a little earlier about a fortress and not a prison. Audio video intercoms at the main entrance can help with that. What that does is it allows for school administrators to vet people before they come into the building. Allows them to see if they really need to come into the building. Do they have an appointment with that principal? If they come in and they're asking to speak to the principal, then you can just merely ask, have you scheduled an appointment? Have you called and telephoned the principal? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's not a prudent thing to let him in the door. And then if they decide to do something else, if they decide to break a window, or now you've got a severe problem you need to handle. So, but it's been elevated rather than it getting in the door and then they elevate it there in front of you, standing across from the, rather than doing that, they can elevate it, at the outside of the door when you need some law enforcement. Couple of things real quick. I want to address this because it's important. If you may be aware of the CARES Act from 2020 and the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, great programs, and they have the added benefit is it is kind of a today solution that addresses the COVID-19 issue, but it's a tomorrow solution, and then it can be a security solution for you in the future. Funds became available in March and at the end of the year, and then back all the way through to the first of this year. And it can be used for security technology if you use the right vernacular. So this is critical for you to know. If you're going to request it through your Department of Education, you need to make sure you're requesting it as part of a COVID-19 mitigation solution and not a security solution, using terms like contact tracing cameras as opposed to surveillance cameras, or analytics that account people or look at loitering as opposed to being a security measure to see if somebody is actually breaking into the building, or video audio intercoms to access limit people coming into the building, not necessarily to vet for a security measure. Touchless access for teachers and staff to make sure that they don't have to unlock the door with a key, but also it has a security piece, but it's also to limit the amount of people that actually touch doors, and it limits their access. So we must just make the administrators aware of this, and so it's more than PPE. The language was intentionally written with some ambiguity because Congress did not want to pigeonhole us into what this money was really about. Every school is different, Rhode Island to Texas to Washington to Florida, we're all different, and we have to approach it a little differently. So while security technology is acceptable, I want to emphasize enough that we don't play upon the word security, that it's really more about how to mitigate COVID-19. And if you've got further questions, please ask, and we can kind of address, touch on that a little further. So at this particular time, it's my honor to introduce our Baghdasserin, who's going to kind of touch on OmniAlert and how they play a role in this holistic approach. All right.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. And so let's talk about a real world situation here where you have an individual who is walking down a hall, could be a school, office building, and he has a firearm. And the question is, at this moment, what exactly do we do? Now what? And we're going to look at this from two lenses, one from a reactive approach, and then we're going to look at this from a proactive approach on how we can mitigate harm caused by gun violence and situations that can be prevented. So let's look at the where we are today. It is very much a reactive. It's about emergency response, and the question is, how do we turn that around and turn it to emergency prevention? So currently today, what would happen is that someone would physically see the gunman and run and call for help, maybe dial 911 on their mobile device. The firearm is discharged. That's how we begin the process to react, right? Is that you have a cue such as a firearm being discharged. At that point, you would manually have to initiate emergency communications, lockdown procedures to the facilities, let people know that there's a situation. The reality is that most active shooter incidents end before police even arrive, because they typically end in less than 5 minutes when it comes to school active shooter situations. So that's not a lot of time. And typically the time, we'll look at some timelines a little bit later in this presentation, but we really don't have much time to respond. And so if we look at a more proactive approach, we have almost every, I would say almost every, if not every facility, every school, every campus has surveillance cameras. So if we can leverage those existing camera systems and apply artificial intelligence to constantly monitor for objects, we're looking for firearms, and being able to automate the lockdown process once a firearm has been identified, that gives us an opportunity to automate the entire process and respond in a much more quick way, giving a head start to those that response, like the Alice protocols, which Brandon Rowan is going to speak to in just a few minutes here. But you have a population that's trained on that response, but you also have a few minutes, a few seconds head start to be able to deploy those actions, that response. And so if we focus on prevention, and we define what prevention is, that is the action of stopping something from happening or arising. It's the action. It's being proactive, proaction. And we look at that from a crime prevention perspective. Many of you are familiar with Minority Report. I always bring this up as really a glimpse into the future where in this science fiction movie, you have something called precognition, the ability to see crimes before they actually happen. And today we don't have that. That doesn't exist. I mean, this is in the world of reality, but we do have the ability to utilize artificial intelligence to automate within a matter of seconds of a crime about to occur. So in some ways, this is sort of like pre-crime. So all of these responses are automated within a matter of seconds of the firearm being detected. This leads us to the most important minute. So that the second that the firearm or an emergency has been identified, we enter the most important minute of the response. What happens in this most important minute is critical, because this will impact the outcome of the entire situation. So really 3 core areas that we'd like to talk about when it comes to that first minute, when it comes to communications. Number 1 is the alerting. Sending out that emergency notifications to everybody, faculty, students, staff, even notifying parents, the community around the facility, if it's a school, because you want to make sure that they're aware that you are aware of the situation, because students, faculty, staff, people will get the word out there, they'll start tweeting I know at my children's high school, they diverted students away from the school grounds because there was an identified, they believed there was an identified individual with a firearm in the hallway. But it took almost an hour before communicating with parents. But during that hour, students were communicating with parents via Twitter, text messages, social media. So it's important to get that holding message out, let people know what's going on, but most importantly, let people know within the facility what to do. We're initiating our protocols, our ALICE protocols or otherwise, letting people know outside the facility, do not come to the property. We are under lockdown. The second, and I also mentioned initiating third-party safety technology. Bruce mentioned access control systems. If it's appropriate, initiate the access control systems. Any other sorts of security measures that you would have on the facility can be automated during that first minute. Secondly, mobilizing your first responder resources. First responders, law enforcement. The reality is that unfortunately most deaths from mass shootings are caused by loss of blood. And if you had first responders, EMT on site just a few minutes earlier, that can make a significant difference. And then finally, collaborating, establishing a remote unified command so you can engage your emergency response team to determine the next steps in your response plan. You can monitor video footage remotely. So you might be on, for example, Jeff Morgan will be speaking in a little bit, might be on vacation with a family, but as the person in charge and responsible for the safety of his facility, he is looped in immediately with a live video feed to discuss the next steps in the action plan and respond to that all simultaneously. So this gives you an idea here of how our gun detection to omniless gun detection technology works, tapping into existing camera systems. It has the ability, once a firearm is detected, it loops in a human to verify that the situation is valid. At that point, you can initiate the automation of the lockdown procedures, such as I mentioned, initiating all of the communications technologies on the facility, off the facility, starting that collaboration, and initiating the access control system. So being able to do that with minimal human interaction is critical. And we know what happens with when you're under duress. We've experienced many times where there was a shooting on a campus facility and the dispatcher was within earshot and was just filled with adrenaline. It's an emotional situation. When you try to type in a message, you try to call 911 to ask for first responder assistance. All of those actions need to be predefined and automated so it can be initiated within a matter of seconds. That is absolutely critical. Finally, we're going to look at some timelines here. So these are the timelines from the current state of things with a reactive timeline versus a proactive approach. So currently, it is a race against the clock. I mean, every second counts when it comes to an emergency. So in the video that we saw earlier, the gun was presented in the hallway, but it wasn't until the firearm was discharged before anyone was made aware of the active shooter situation. And that could be a minute, 2 minutes into the situation. At that point, you have your response protocols activated. In this case, we're initiating the ALICE protocols. And by the time the person responsible for calling for help, could be anyone with access to a phone or a device, requests help, this might be a minute later into the situation. And it's not until several minutes later before police are actually on site, the lockdown alert is initiated, and so that the whole process has played out to the disadvantage of the response. So we look at a proactive approach. So the firearm is presented and the gun is detected within a matter of seconds of that firearm being presented. We've got a number of deployments right now with schools and running the detection capability. So the firearm is detected within a matter of seconds. Okay, within a matter of seconds, those ALICE protocols are activated right away. Within seconds, first responders, police are summoned right away. Lockdown alert was initiated right away, and so there's no need to manually call and request first responders, law enforcement. It's all automated, and so within a matter of seconds, this gives everyone a head start. And that head start, whether it's 5 seconds, 10 seconds, a minute, that time is invaluable. And so by the time that if the firearm is discharged, you've already summoned police and first responders. Ambulance, EMT are on site at that moment, and hopefully divert an outcome that is less desirable. So just to wrap things up before I turn over to Brandon to go into more depth about ALICE protocols and being prepared, we when we talk about developing muscle memory on knowing what to do. So the last thing on my list there is knowing what to do with confidence. It's critical that your people, your employees, your staff, your students know what to do with confidence. So when you leverage preventative technology like visual gun detection with artificial intelligence, right? You give that advanced warning, which is a head start to be able to initiate those protocols and automate those first minute and most important minute actions. Don't have time to do one thing at a time. You need to be able to have that all pre-scripted, ready to go, so they can be launched simultaneously and avert a situation that is obviously clearly undesirable. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Brandon Roan from Navigate 360. He will go into more depth about knowing what to do with confidence.
Thanks, R. Appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone here today. So we're going to talk about the ALICE response brought to you as a solution of Navigate 360. So we're all very aware of these violent critical incidents, these active shooter events that take place all across the nation and just about every organization, from education to house of worship to healthcare to retail, corporate America, you name the industry, and we see these events happen. And what's really important to understand, as Ara talked about, is there's a saying that I like to, and it says simply this: when the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And what does that really mean? As Ara talked about, having that level of preparedness already done, so that when you find yourself in any one of these situations, you can see this quote here from the young lady who found herself in the midst of a violent critical incident in a mall when she was shopping, right? What did she say? Her training helped her to be able to stay calm, right? So again, when the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And we see these events happening all across the nation. And whether you're on this webinar from a house of worship, an education setting, corporate America, retail industry, factory, healthcare, it doesn't really matter. What's important is understanding that there is an opportunity, there is a window of time when Arya talks about that timeline where you need to be empowered to be able to increase your own survivability. Because statistically, we know that these events are from start to finish happen in a matter of minutes. And we know that our gunmen, overwhelming majority percentage of the time, over 90% of the time, is a lone gunman. And so when we think about that lone attacker coming into an occupied structure, we need to be able to put ourselves in a position to do something about it. And quite frankly, it is like any other life skill we've learned, right? We all remember fire safety. We all remember stranger danger. And we were taught and we were given tools to put in our toolbox to be able to increase our survival. If I was to ask any one of you on this call or this webinar, what would you do if your clothes caught on fire? Without hesitation, without thought, the overwhelming majority of the people in this room would yell, stop, drop, and roll. Why is that? Is because that was a lesson that was taught to us at a very young age in an appropriate manner. And ALICE training, these survival strategies is exactly the same. And I'll touch briefly on that on the back end of this presentation. But when we think about that, again, remember, we've been through stranger danger. If I were to ask any one of you, what were you told to do at a young age when the creepy guy in the white minivan shows up to the park and tries to entice you to get in the minivan with candy or a dog or some sort of appealing device? We would all say run, right? Because again, we learned that at a very young age. And so when we look at these ALICE strategies, it's another life skill. It's another tool to put in the toolbox to increase our survivability when we find ourselves facing that dangerous situation. Sorry, folks, just had a bit of a technical difficulty here. So again, talking about that life skill, age and ability appropriate training, right? Strategies that are used by anybody, whether you're the 5-year-old kindergartner or you are the 16-year-old high school senior or the 35-year-old office worker or the 68-year-old retired person out for an afternoon lunch. These strategies, these option-based strategies, you're going to pick what option works best for you. When we talk about training in that K-12 setting, we're talking about curriculum-focused training, right? What does a particular strategy, or how does a particular strategy look or play out or be taught to that 5-year-old kindergarten student or that 11-year-old 6th grade student, right? We hear oftentimes that we can't do this because it's traumatizing. But when we look at the ALICE teachings and trainings of surviving a violent critical incident, it is appropriate, right? Because we are teaching these strategies at the appropriate level for each individual. And most importantly, it's about empowering folks to participate in their own survival, right? We want folks to be able to determine, okay, what can I do? What can I do? How can I increase my survival? And that's a great question, because that leads us to the ALICE acronym: the alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and evacuate. The incident will always start with the alert, right? What is the stimulus that we're receiving? And once we receive that stimulus, whether it be auditory, visual, smell, whatever, however it is we're receiving that stimulus to this event taking place, now we need to look at, okay, what of these other options best fits my situation right now? Is it lockdown? Is it counter? Is it evacuate? And how can I inform others, folks in the rest of the building where you are or the location where you are, 911, how can I inform others? How can I get information out to other folks so that they can now make a decision and they know it's safe to do so? And also, again, the counter strategy, when we look at taking back control, when you look at this diagram, for those of you who have any military or law enforcement background, this this diagram looks very familiar to you. It's commonly referred to as the OODA loop. It stands for observe, orient, decide, act. How can we take that OODA loop, which is basically a process of decision making, and how can we use a physiological, psychological approach to interrupt that thought process, that OODA loop, to be able to take back control and increase our survival? That's a counter strategy. And then the evacuate, pretty self-explanatory, right? Remove yourself from the dangerous location. Listen, folks, it's really simple. We have a simple task when we find ourselves facing this violent critical incident. Either remove ourselves from the dangerous location, evacuate, or render that location no longer dangerous. Counter or lockdown. And that's really what it comes down to. Those two very simple tasks. And when we talk about proactive training, when we talk about option-based training, we use this slide because it's just 100% spot on to understanding how survivability works when you look at it from a proactive versus passive response. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about this slide, but this slide is from Virginia Tech, the second floor of Norris Hall, where that mass homicide, that violent critical incident took place. And simply put, if you look at classroom 204 and 205, they have double-digit survivability. When you look at classrooms 206 and 211, they have double-digit fatalities. And the question is, well, why is that? And the answer is pretty simple. It's because 204 and 205 took a proactive approach during that violent critical incident, whereby whereas 206 and 211 did not. And folks, listen, this is not to point the finger at Virginia Tech and those folks, because quite frankly, they did exactly what they were taught to do, which is that traditional lockdown, right? Get in a corner, hide under tables, and dial 911 or hope for the best that somebody was going to come do something about it. But when we look at the numbers here, we're talking about really 28 versus 2. 28 versus 2. 28 people who were killed in passive responses versus 2 who were killed in proactive responses. And that's really what it comes down to. Simply being proactive to be able to do that. And so how can you get your hands on this training, right? You want more information. You want to get your organization trained. Well, there's 3 different ways we can do that. We can do that through our e-learning module. Self-paced, self-guided online training that your folks could log on when either they're assigned to or when they have time to, and go through the training. My favorite is the on-site training. That's that face-to-face person interaction, where not only do we have the hearing by way of presentation, we have the understanding through seeing of demonstrations, and then doing through scenario-based training. So we accomplish those 3 stages, 3 styles of learning: hear, see, and do. And then there is the live virtual training, which again gives you that live interactive training. But however, it does take away the hands-on because obviously you need to be face-to-face to do that. So if you are on this webinar and you are thinking, okay, how can I get my organization to be trained? These are the 3 ways that will work for your organization: e-learning, on-site, or our virtual-based training. And so I appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Brandon. Some of you may be thinking and wondering why somebody from LendingTree is on this call. And as Elizabeth had mentioned, I'm the Director of Corporate Security and Resiliency for LendingTree. I've been here for 2 years now. And before coming to LendingTree, I spent over 11 years at the University of Central Florida as a Director of Emergency Management and Security for that campus in Orlando, Florida. Where unfortunately we had an active shooter event. We've had multiple cases of people being on campus with guns, so gunmen on campus kind of responses and things like that. So all this technology and everything that we've kind of learned here are very important. And what I wanted to do with my time with you all is to kind of pass on some of the lessons learned that I've had through over 20 years of physical security and also emergency management. So with that being said, as an emergency manager, what I wanted to do is kind of break it down into the 5 phases of emergency management and kind of share with you all some of the things that we've experienced and pass on, again, lessons learned. So if you haven't heard of CPTED, it's crime prevention through environmental design. This can be taken by anyone that works in the organization within facilities, law enforcement, your emergency management folks, your housing individuals, or anyone within your corporation or your company that has to do with the facility. And this really helps them kind of help design, preventative measures such as lighting, landscaping, deterrence, and doing risk assessments on what you have in your surrounding locations inside the camp, inside your building and outside your building, so you can kind of keep an eye on and keep your folks safe as best as possible. One of those measures, as Bruce kind of talked a little bit about, is access control and video surveillance. Of course, these can not only just act as deterrents, but they'll help you identify suspicious activity, trends, patterns. I know, for example, in one event, we had a large special event happening, and we had our security cameras put out, and we noticed an individual walk around with a jacket on a very hot Florida day with a large bag, which was very uncommon. And of course, we've had officers go out and make contact with the individual, and he had things on him that he shouldn't have had, and we asked the individual to kind of leave campus. So it kind of really gives you kind of eyes on your surrounding environment, whether you're able to do that live or just during special events. But if anything, it helps you definitely identify any type of trends and patterns. So ensuring that you have a very robust access control and security system, video surveillance system, is very important. You want to make sure you also integrate your access badge system with your HR software, especially if you have a multi-tenant facility or building. because one of the things that I've witnessed and experienced and had to address on several occasions is the fact that a lot of times your HR system is not tied in with your access control. So when you have an individual, a student, or a faculty or staff that's either retired or moved on, or unfortunately fired from the job, they're removed out of the system right away. Because I've seen many places where they've been disparate access control systems, and that individual has left their job, and for months and even years later, they still have access to these facilities because no one bothered to check and remove those individuals. So those are things that you want to kind of definitely take a look at. And in today's day and age of technology, integration with access control and different HR software is very doable and something that should definitely be considered moving forward. As far as mitigation goes, some of the things that I've done is, we walked different sites with our architects, the folks that design the space, our law enforcement partners, to try and identify safe rooms, come up with lockdown plans, and those type of things. So when we activate the run, hide, fight theory for folks to try and to kind of get away from an active shooter situation, we want to make sure that when folks are planned, there's a plan on what they're supposed to be doing. They exercise that plan, and that we have a way to be able to kind of execute that immediately. So that way law enforcement can come and neutralize the threat and definitely save the day at that point. One of the things that we've learned is, you want to make sure when you identify these safe rooms that you have instructions put on the back of the door to kind of remind people how to be quiet. And also you want to ensure that those spaces are going to be able to have cell phone service, because one of the things that we ask people to do during those events is to call 911, and we want them to be able to call 911 from the location that they're in. With a lot of the different way that a lot of our newer buildings are being built, sometimes cell service can be an issue when it comes into the center of a building. So those are things that you definitely want to take a look at. And with that goes like the LEED concern. So of course, everyone wants to go with the platinum or gold LEED certified building, which is a very nice and beautiful looking building. But it also comes with some of the different challenges, and that kind of really challenge our theories on run, hide, and fight, specifically the hide portion of it. So when you start building walls that are solid glass walls in conference rooms and classrooms to kind of bring in the sunlight, the natural light into the space, you got to think about how you want to provide and give those folks privacy. And one of the things I know that we've done in the past is we've put safety film on these large glass windows, glass walls, so that way, it's not going to stop a bullet from going through, but it's definitely going to slow down a person from making entry into a specific space. And then with those, we ask folks to turn off the lights, and a lot of our newer LEED requirements is using occupancy sensors, so that way the lights come on when someone walks into the space. So making sure that you have light switches where you can override the occupancy sensor is pretty important in those type of scenarios, so that way folks can go ahead and do exactly as they're trained. And then it comes down to protection. So this is where you want to make sure you have policies and procedures, like Ara was mentioning. When you have any type of analytic in any way be able to notify folks right away, you have to move along with your policies and procedures just as quickly. So making sure you have those, people are trained on those, and those are routinely rewritten and exercised is very important. So that's when the training portion comes in. And of course, exercising all of those type of drills, lockdowns, and evacuations are very, very critical. So moving on to the two phases here when the event actually occurs is now we go into response and recovery. So you want to make sure you understand what the incident command structure is and how it's used and what your role may be in it. You may want to identify yourself somehow with a vest or some kind of way to identify you, so that way first responders know that you're with that organization and that you have data information that can be very helpful for those folks when they're trying to do their response to the incident. So for instance, we had, a suspicious package at one situation, and it became something that lasted hours, and the bomb team had to send in a robot into the facility. And one of the things that was nice was we were able to grab the building manager, facilities manager, and they came in and let us know, looking at the floor plans, exactly what was how the space was laid out, and also they passed on that, for instance, there was one door that they were going to send a robot through where there was 3 steps that was very steep, and that would have been damaging to that bomb robot. So that was something they were able to pass on that wasn't reflected on the floor plans. So you know your facilities and your campus better than your first responders. So this is something that you want to make sure that you work very closely with them and that you do have a role in incident command structure, and how do you integrate with that? Those are things you want to learn. Then, of course, understanding what your communication plan is. So most universities will have a mass notification system, and that should be a very redundant system. So it's not only just text and emails, but digital signs, outdoor sirens, indoor notifications. So there just should be different layers of being able to notify folks of the situation. But then you also want to understand what you're going to be doing for your press briefings. For us, we've identified several locations on campus that we can do press briefings that was large enough, and they had the parking lots large enough to allow media and other folks to kind of show up. And we had several of those identified. So that way we can kind of train and practice those. And that way, if a situation happened on the north side of campus, we had something available to us on the south side, and vice versa, and even off campus if we weren't able to do it on campus at all. Those are things that you want to kind of think about. The more planning you do ahead, the more time it's going to save you when they actually happen, and you're able to execute that. You want to also make sure that you have some kind of a go bag ready. So Ara mentioned being able to respond remotely, and sometimes you may not be at your facility, or you may have to go on scene. So you want to bring a bag with you. It's going to have floor plans, maybe keys to an access card, or keys to a facility, a map of the campus of your location there, a list of contractors that you may have to contact, and of course an emergency recall plan. Those are all things that you're going to want to make sure you have with you. So when you're on scene integrating, you're able to communicate with those folks, give them what they need, and also communicate back to your university and your chain of command on what you're learning and what needs to be done and what resources are being requested at that point. You also want to make sure you work very closely with your first responders. Include them in your lockdown planning and discussions and your exercises, whether it's a tabletop or a functional or even a full-scale exercise. Those are all very important things that you want to do as far as helping you with the response side of it. And then finally comes recovery. So these are things that you want to think about. Now that it happened, now what are you going to do, right? So one of the things that we learned very quickly is, you want to make sure you have a biohazard cleanup contract. Who's going to be able to come in there and deal with a crime scene and do the cleanup of whatever occurred in that location? You want to have those contracts ready to go. I can tell you we've had it for different scenarios. I know when we were going through brainstorming and putting together a plan for Ebola, for instance, there was a lot of contractors that were not comfortable with that environment, and that kind of so we knew that we weren't going to be able to establish those particular contracts. So we sought after new ones for folks that were comfortable with that. So have those discussions with your contract folks, and have a better understanding of how and when they would get involved in those type of scenarios. Short-term planning, you want to make sure that your folks are very comfortable. One of the things with a post event, and you're able to communicate with your people that's been impacted by this. During our active shooter situation, the individual's plan was to pull the fire alarm, and he did that, and he drew folks out, and thank goodness for us, his weapon jammed, and his life was the only one that was lost that day. He had another sidearm ready for that purpose. But it took us months to get students comfortable with leaving their rooms and their housing facility when the fire alarm was pulled or when the fire alarm went off. So those are things you need to think about. How would you kind of, one, make the parents comfortable, make the students feel comfortable? We did it in phases. We had a lot of counseling seminars. We had fire rescue come in and talk about the importance of evacuating, how to evacuate. And of course, now there's a different layer of things that you got to think about when they evacuate as well. They got to pay attention to not just assuming that it's a fire, but also that it may be an active shooter situation. So they just need to be a little bit more aware of that. A lot of our students left thinking it was a fire, and what they left behind was cell phones and medication. And they didn't go back to the rooms for over 18 hours. So we had students that needed medication, so we had to make sure we got that to them. It was early morning hours, So they left in pajamas, and then 18 hours later, we had to give them clothing. We had to make sure that we had set up a bunch of phones so they can call back and talk to their mom and dads and let them know. Because once it hit national news, it was all over the place. And of course, their parents are trying to contact these students, and their phones were in their rooms where they weren't allowed to go back. So those are things you just want to think about when you start talking about family reunification and things like that too. So those are some of the short-term plans that you need to think about. And then on the long-term side, to wrap this up, you want to make sure that you have a plan for what happens post-event. What are you going to do with that facility? What are you going to do with that space when people come out and bring out, pictures and toys and flowers and leave things behind to help grieve? What is your plan for that? Because that's going to go on for weeks, months, and even years, depending on how bad the situation is. So having those as a plan is very important. But again, to wrap things up here, I wanted to definitely pass on some lessons learned, some best practices from things that I've encountered and things that we're doing and planning for here in Adam with Lending Tree. And with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass this back to Elizabeth for the questions and answer session.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Jeff. We have had lots of questions that have come in, so I think we can go ahead and get started with that. This first one I'm going to direct to Bruce, and that is, how much time and effort should school administrators put forth pertaining to active shooter events compared to other security anomalies?
Well, we are so fearful of active shooters, and we should be, of course. But I want to make this comment just to make it be, for full disclosure. The potential for an active assailant in any school institution is very low, very rare. And Jeff experienced it, but it's very low, very rare. We all agree. But to the point that's been made today is really two things: preparation, if it does happen, and understanding that if it does happen, it's a very quick event. A recent United States Secret Service a study concluded that 85% of active assailant situations on a college or high or a K-12 institutions ends in less than 5 minutes. So what we're trying to get across today is the preparation piece, it's the planning piece. So I'm saying, no, don't be shaking in your shoes that this is, the thing that you've got to be prepared for. There are a lot of other things. You've got disgruntled parents upset about certain things that maybe the school board made a decision last night. You've got situations of student and student bullying that might arise to aggression and violence. You've got, issues even of student drop off and pickup, and maybe the driving pattern, and a lot of things you have to consider. So I'm just saying, you need to prepare, you need to plan, but and I certainly support students being involved and parents being involved, because their confidence level will rise and their anxiety level will diminish. And if it does happen, and I pray that it doesn't, but if it does, the solution, the result will probably be better than we hope for.
Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate that. And I think this next one is meant for Ara. It is OmniAlert gun detect the same as gunshot detection?
Thanks, Elizabeth. No, it is not. In fact, it's very different. Gunshot detection typically uses an audible alert. What was the term used, Brandon? Something that what initiates the response. So the alert is generated from an audible or ballistic alert, if you will. Firearm was discharged. The OmniAlert gun detect it's more a preventative measure. It's on the front end, trying to identify a firearm before it has been deployed, as soon as it has been presented. So it's very different.
Okay, and Brandon, how does run, hide, fight differ from ALICE training?
Sure. So run, hide, fight is basically an awareness campaign. When you look at ALICE training, that is true training by definition, right? Going back to accomplishing the 3 styles of learning: the hear, seeing, doing. Also curriculum, age and ability appropriate. So when you think of how they separate. That's really, an awareness campaign versus an actual training, a documented and certificated training as well, right? And so that's really what it comes down to. Curriculum, documented, certificated training covers the 3 styles of learning. It also covers the blended methodology from the Inter Security Council in 2015, where you have the curriculum piece, whether it be face-to-face or e-learning, and then the hands-on.
Okay, and actually, Brandon, I just received another one for you. What is your opinion on leaving the lights in the classroom on as opposed to off, particularly for the younger age kids? If teachers need to evacuate quietly, it is much more difficult in the darkness.
And so again, that's a great question. Depending on particular circumstances, that you might find times where the lights off are going to be beneficial, right? If you fortify and barricade and give that illusion that there's nobody there. But there are going to be times where it's maybe not efficient. If the appropriate response is to evacuate, I'm not worried about the lights. Get out the door, right? Because whether the lights are on or off, the room's going to be empty when the gunman gets there, and that's all we're really worried about. So again, it really comes down to the particular elements of the situation and what fits best.
Okay, and Jeff, I'm going to send this one your way. What suggestions do you have for collaborating with your safety team when you're in these emergency situations?
Yeah, sure. So I'll add to something on what Brandon just mentioned too for that question, if you don't mind, Elizabeth.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. So one of the things I know that I witnessed at another school, what they did was when you walk through, and usually a classroom door is going to have that small glass, right? You can kind of look in and see what's inside. And what this particular school did was they painted a band around the top of the window of the wall, and it stopped where the blind spot started. So this way they can have the students kind of go behind that line and hide, knowing that when someone looks through that window, they can't see those individuals. So if you keep the lights on, as long as the students are hidden behind that and you know that they're in a safe area, that's probably ideal, because you want that person to look in there and see nobody. And that way they move on to the next door, and they can hopefully keep moving on until the first responders get there. But I thought that was a very clever technique that one school did in order to kind of identify this is kind of where you can see inside that window, this is where you can't see inside the window. It's very clear defined for those teachers to kind of plan around that. So that might be something to consider for the folks that do know things. But going back to collaboration, that's very important, right? So when these incidents happen, yes, the first responders are going to have a role. They're going to have a very important role, and they're going to be very busy. But your school and your campus is also going to have a major role as well. So being able to communicate that and notify your folks. One of the things that we looked at was when we decided to go and purchase a crisis communication platform, we wanted to make sure that you're able to do that remotely, because when that campus goes on lockdown, people aren't coming to your emergency operations center, right? Because they can't, and they shouldn't, because until the cops say that it's safe. So what we did was, if folks are able to and safely able to log into our crisis management software, then we can start communicating right away. And inside that communication software, we had checklists for different roles and responsibilities for facilities, for our medical folks, for our senior executives. These are things that we needed them to focus on and start thinking about right away post-incident, so we can start responding to those kind of things. And then in that room, that's where you collaborate. You start discussing. And once law enforcement deems the campus safe, now folks can come back into your emergency operations center and start working on your response and recovery efforts from that point forward. So that way there's no delay there, because there are definitely things that's going to be like that. So if you can't afford some kind of a crisis response plan or software, one thing that you might want to consider doing, and we've done this in the past too, is to establish a conference bridge. So that this way you can bring people in that can safely do that and start having discussions on what you're trying to do and what's happening, so you can start planning that ahead. So having that technology is all great, but the most important thing to do is identify procedures and then exercising and training to those, and that's going to help you with at least your response to that situation.
Thank you, Jeff. And Bruce, How about I send this one your way? Can you better explain how a holistic approach to school security involves active shooter prevention?
Well, you heard our experts today talk a lot about it. The holistic approach is more than, of course, just gun detection, or it could be even sound detection that might hear the gun fire. It even starts with what Jeff kind of alluded to with film on the glass. I mean, many of us recall, of course, the Sandy Hook tragedy back in 2012. Many people are not aware that the shooter actually just shot through the glass and then just stepped right through, and then he perpetrated his crime. While the bullets would have been stopped, wouldn't be stopped by the film, he probably would not have gained entry and therefore started the clock. A gun detected, sound heard, 4 or 5 minutes before the whole thing went in. Police gets there in 2 or 3 minutes. It could have been an entirely different outlook. So when we say a holistic approach, we're saying that it involves, stopping somebody at the door and vetting them. It involves film on the glass. It involves gun detection. It involves all these things. It involves, Alice and being prepared because the alert went out and now lock the doors, get secluded and get ready, or escape, whichever it's going to be convenient. It's all these things is the holistic approach. Everything comes together, and that's how this plays a role. Is don't think it's just training. It's Alice training. Don't think it's just that. Take a look at the holistic approach and what else goes with it to preserve life and save injury. That's really what it's about. Because like even Ara mentioned, more than not, folks die from loss of blood than they actually do a direct gunshot. And if we can get this situation solved much faster, and we might save a lot more lives.
Just to add on that, Bruce, and we've discussed many times, it's about creating a culture of safety, right? And that's in the DNA of the organization. That's in the DNA of the campus or the school, and that's really the culmination of a holistic approach. It's the technology, it's the knowledge, the know-how, the confidence, the procedures. All of those things really make up a culture of safety, and it's important to look at it from that perspective.
And Ara, actually, this next one is for you as well. How accurate is the AI gun detection?
Pretty accurate. It's because it's AI. It's constantly learning different objects, and so I mean, literally every day it gets better and better. It's as far as I don't have the exact numbers on the accuracy. If there is any sort of index that would categorize that, I'm not aware of that. But the nice thing is that it's constantly learning. It's constantly improving. It's learning different objects. Obviously, right now it's focused on firearms, learning every different type of firearms. Like I said, it's deployed in a number of live environments and constantly learning from that as well. And the nice thing is that it is shared. That collective knowledge, if you will, is shared to all the deployments on a regular basis. So it's an automated process. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Brandon, what type of proactive measures can be applied in an active shooter situation?
That's a great question. There are lots of proactive measures, right? When we talk about obviously evacuating, removing yourself from that dangerous location, fortifying, barricading that door. If for whatever reason you don't know it's safe to leave, or maybe you do know it's safe to leave, but at the very least, you know that at that moment, the threat is not in your space, right? And so now we can fortify and barricade using environmental tools such as whatever's in the room, whether it be a desk, a table, a filing cabinet, a bookshelf, a refrigerator, a freezer, whatever you have in the room. And the idea there is to completely deny or drastically delay entry into that room. But understanding that we have to do some work on the front end. Remember I said, when the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And so another example of what I mean by that, I need to know if I'm going to fortify and barricade this door, very importantly, I need to know which way does this door open, in or out, because that's going to dictate and determine how I apply this barricade. I need to know that on the front end, because scientifically, through neuroscience, I can tell you that that frontal cortex, that frontal lobe of your brain will close down. You will not be able to process information. So if you've not already stored that to that amygdala, that midbrain, that Rolodex, it is not going to happen for you when that stress-induced environment happens. And so when we talk about, being able to pick different strategies, there's so many different ways to go. And so if you come to our training or you become a certified instructor, we will teach you or teach your instructor how to take the lockdown, counter, and evacuate based on the alert, and then how to use those tools in your toolbox based on your location and the situation and the way it's happening around you.
Thanks so much, Brandon, and thank you all for spending time with us this afternoon. I had a few questions coming in about the recording of the presentation. We will be sending that out to everyone who registered. Also, please go ahead and keep an eye out for upcoming webinars, as we have plenty throughout the year, and have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.